Alright, so in our last part, we looked at the code, we understood how the app works from the point of view of the code, and we kind of decided what's wrong with it, what we can refactor. And we said that the first step is to take that big method called showRestaurants that basically encapsulates the whole logic of the application and try to make it shorter, try to shorten it, to split it into several smaller methods. And that's the plan. Now, I know that you might be facing similar issues at work or in your projects, because I was doing this in the beginning as well. I was just getting my feature done. I was just creating whatever logic I needed in one method or two, and I didn't care exactly if the method is too long or not. Now, there is a saying, and I know that Uncle Bob said that, Robert C. Martin, if you know him, and he said that method should come in small sizes and they should be smaller than smallest. And that's some kind of interpretation that I've given it. They're not his exact words, but what he's trying to say is that the methods should be short and clear on what they are doing. So that means that they should have a clear name, and they should not have a lot of code, a lot of logic in it. So an ideal measure for a method would be, for example, in my case, I usually try to make my methods between 15 and 30 lines. So they are decent, they are not too big, they are not too small. You don't want to have methods with 5 lines or 3 lines, because that wouldn't make too much sense. You probably have a method that doesn't do too much. So the main idea for me is to have methods between 15 and 30 lines. I don't want you to take this as a golden rule, but it's a good pointer, at least for me, to try to figure out how big a method should be depending on the project and the case. Now, going back to our project, we noticed that our method is huge. It has 90 lines or something like that. So clearly it surpasses any kind of decent margin of what a method should have in terms of lines of code. So we have to split it. And by splitting it, we're going to split it into smaller methods. The first step into doing that is identifying what happens in the method and trying to separate the logic that is in that method. And we kind of did that last time. We identified that the first thing that was happening was getting the restaurants from the server. And then we were parsing the restaurants, which was fine. And then we ordered and filtered them. And then finally we prepared them for display. So all of these actions are they are potentially good for their individual methods, their individual functions. So what we are going to do, we are going to have a slimmer showRestaurants method that in turn is going to call some smaller methods that are basically more specific to what they do. In our case, we are going to have the first method here, getRestaurantResponse, which is basically going to get the restaurants from the server. Now we are going to have another method which is going to parse the response, the restaurants that we get. And then we're going to have another method that is going to filter the restaurants, right? Finally, we need to have another method for preparing the restaurants for display, and I called it prepare restaurants. It doesn't really matter, but it has to be some kind of suggestive naming on the action that it does. So going back to the showRestaurants parent method, this one is going to basically call the getRestaurantResponse, which is the first one, and then call the parse response, and then the filter, and then the prepare restaurants for display. So right off the bat, you can see that the showRestaurants should be obviously smaller, because the actual purpose of this method is to call other methods and kind of do some kind of chain reaction of the logic. And all of these methods, they are going to do something specific. So before going into the actual code, let's do a quick summary, a quick review on what we just discussed. We know that we want to always aim for decent size methods. So when we are refactoring code and projects, we try to find such methods that are pretty big, and we try to kind of shorten them and split them into several other methods, therefore reducing the whole size of the method. How we do this, we kind of have some kind of guidelines. We know that the methods should be shorter than 30, 45 lines. This is usually around this kind of margin. And as you remember, as I just said, Robert C. Martin said that functions or methods in our case should be small, smaller than small. And don't worry, that's not me, that's him there. Alright, so we know that they should be shorter than huge Goliath methods. We want to avoid godlike methods and classes. And we want them to be longer than 3 lines maybe. We just don't want to have redundant methods. They need to do something. Alright, so let's review also how we are going to do this. We are going to shorten it by splitting it into several smaller methods. What we do first is identify the core actions of the big method. We kind of see what it does. And after identifying the actions, we create smaller methods for each action. Therefore, each smaller method is going to do only one thing and only one good thing. And finally, we kind of chain the new methods inside the big method with all the handling that is needed. And therefore, the big method that we initially had should be right now much smaller, and we can much easier identify what each method does and where our bug might be, or where exactly we have to add a new feature. So right now we have reviewed the whole summary, and let's go in the code and let's actually apply what we just learned.